All right. My name is Aaron Yarmel. Thank you very much for tuning in. So I'm joined today by an incredibly exciting guest. I'm here talking to Ronnie Lee. Welcome, Ronnie. So Ronnie is one of the founders of the Animal Liberation Front. And he's had many decades of experience as an activist, probably one of the most well-known members of the Animal Liberation Front ever, and maybe even one of the most well-known animal rights activists, ever in the history. So, without any further ado, let's just get into this. So welcome, Ronnie. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Hi, it's great to be on here. Great to be talking to you.
Yeah. So, for those of our viewers who don't know what the Animal Liberation Front is, how would you describe it?
Well, it's probably best to kind of start with the history of how it began, and it all kind of started off with me becoming a vegetarian in 1969. And the reason I became a vegetarian was because my sister's boyfriend at the time, who became her first husband, was a vegetarian. He was a very good athlete. He'd been a vegetarian since he was young. He thought it was wrong to eat animals because we didn't need to, and he was a very fit guy. I was a really big meat eater, but what he said got me thinking, and within a very short period of time, I decided I just had to be a vegetarian. There was no excuse for me to carry on eating meat. But of course, like a lot of vegetarians, I didn't know what went on with the dairy industry and the egg industry. I didn't realize there was anything wrong with those things. So I was a vegetarian for a couple of years, and then I found out about veganism. I found out about a lot of other things. I found out about vivisection, the fur trade, about hunting, all of these things. And I decided, well, first of all, I had to go vegan, and secondly, that I had to start campaigning against all these atrocities that are being committed to animals. And so shortly after becoming vegan, I joined the Hunt Saboteurs Association and started going out and taking direct action to stop the hunt from killing foxes and hares and other animals. But after a while, I began to think that that a kind of more hard-hitting type of action was needed. There were some forms of hunting it was difficult for the hunt saboteurs to do anything about. And so I thought, well, it would be good to be able to damage the property of these people so they couldn't actually go hunting in the first place. And there were a few other people that felt like me, and we had a meeting, and this would have been in June of 1972, I think it would have been, or was it 72? No, 1973, June of 1973. We had a meeting huddled in the corner of a basement cafe in London. There were six of us, and we decided we would form a new organisation, because the hunt saboteurs tried to keep within the law, although they carried out direct action. They tried to keep within the law, and they still do so. So property damage wasn't something the hunt saboteurs would want to be involved with. So we decided we had to form a new organisation, and the name we chose for it might sound a rather strange name, but it was the Band of Mercy. And the reason for that was, in the 19th century, there was an RSPCA youth group called the Band of Mercy, and they were really quite militant, not like the RSPCA today. I mean, these young people went out and they damaged guns that are being used by shooting to stop animals being killed, and that kind of thing. And we wanted to revive the spirit of that, so we thought, oh, we'll call ourselves that name. And so we kind of embarked on actions, and the first actions were against the hunts. We damaged the vehicles that they used to go hunting, and we then found out about a vivisection laboratory that's being built, and we caused a lot of damage to that as well, and to some boats that we used for hunting baby seals. We did a lot of damage to those as well, and then various other places that were involved in supplying animals to laboratories would cause damage there. Eventually, a couple of us got arrested, and we got sentenced to 3 years in prison. We were both in prison for a year because we'd never been in prison before. We got let out early. We didn't have to do the whole sentence. And this was now early 1976, and when I came out of prison, I was really pleasantly surprised at the number of people that wanted to do the same thing. I thought, having been sent to prison, it would actually put people off, but it didn't. The publicity from it encouraged people. More people were saying, I want to do that. I want to get involved in that. But people weren't very happy about the name. The name didn't say anything about animals. It sounded like a religious organisation, really, Band of Mercy. So we decided to change the name to Animal Liberation Front, because that summed up exactly what we were all about. And that was in the summer of 1976. That's when the name changed, and things carried on very much the same as they were, with damage to property. The main targets really were vivisection, animal experimentation, hunting, and the fur trade. Those tended to be the main targets that we went for. And by now, because we had a lot more people involved, we were able to actually rescue animals, because rescuing animals from places needs more people. You need more people involved to take the animals away than you do to cause the damage. So because we had more people, we were able to rescue animals as well. And it kind of carried on like that. And then in 77, I was arrested again for it was for rescuing some mice from a place that was supplying them to laboratories, and also causing damage to this particular building that we broke into. And I got a 12-month sentence for that, and I was in prison for 8 months of that sentence. And that then takes us up to 78. And then I kind of became the press officer for the Animal Liberation Front, because whenever somebody did an ALF action, because I was kind of fairly well known now, I've been in prison twice for ALF actions. The press would contact me, the media would contact me and ask me, why is it that people have damaged this place? Why have people taken animals out of a laboratory or somewhere like that? And I would be there to explain what went on, what was being done to those animals, and why people took that action. So I kind of became the press officer, and I kind of was in that role for a number of years. And then in 1986, I was arrested again, and this time it was a lot more serious, because I was actually charged with encouraging other people to carry out actions. I mean, I've been doing actions myself, but they couldn't actually prove that I'd done any action. But what they were able to prove was that I'd encouraged other people to do things, and through articles that I'd written in magazines and other things I did, that I'd conspired with people to do stuff, and I'd encourage people. And I ended up getting a 10-year sentence. I was sentenced to 10 years in prison. I was in I kind of did 6 years and 8 months of that sentence. So I was then released in November of 1992. So that was kind of my, very briefly, my involvement with the Animal Liberation Front. And of course, loads of other people. At one time, there were hundreds of people in prison in the UK for ALF activities. It was, it was very, very active at one time. Not nearly as active now. But the 70s, 80s, 90s were a very, very active period.
Wow. I mean, that is a fascinating history. So when you were in that small room in the London basement in the summer of, you said was it 73?
Yeah, it was 73.
Yeah, so June of 1973, you're in this basement room with a bunch of other people. You're going to form the Band of Mercy. What was the energy in the room like? Like, did you have any idea that you were starting something that would go on to become like one of the most impressive global animal rights groups ever?
Not at all. I think we just didn't know. We realised we were taking a chance, and we didn't know whether it would work or not. We didn't know whether it would catch on. We just knew that something more needed to be done. See, at the time, the situation across the board for animals was getting worse and worse. The number of experiments on animals in the UK was increasing every year. The fur trade was increasing. There were fur farms all over the country. Hunting hunting was going on, was still lots of hunts going out all the time, for instance. And the organisations that existed at the time to combat these things didn't seem to be getting anywhere. They didn't seem to be making progress. That they were just kind of really asking their members to send them money and to write to politicians. Basically, that was what they were all about. And it didn't seem to us that it was making any difference. And we felt that something much more hard hitting needed to be done. And that's what we wanted to do. But we really had no idea what would happen. We said to ourselves at the time, we're taking a big chance here. We don't know what's going to happen, but we have to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So then you said around like 76, 77, there's a lot more actions going on. People are getting arrested. People are in prison. And one thing you said that was kind of fascinating was that you said that it seems like that didn't deter mobilization. Like the state repression didn't. Can you talk, like, why was that?
I thought it would, because when I was in prison, I thought that the fact that I got a prison sentence, and that another guy as well who was with me got the same sentence as me, that would put people off. People would be deterred by that. They'd be frightened of taking that risk. So I was fairly pessimistic about what would happen, and I was really pleasantly surprised that when I came out of jail, I had all these people coming up to me saying, "I want to do that. How do I get involved in it?" And you know. And I was delighted. I thought, this is brilliant. This is kind of, it stirred people up, and because I think there was a lot of people that you see at the time during the 70s, it was kind of the beginnings of the animal rights movement, and for some reason, or maybe for various reasons, people, especially young people, were getting much more concerned about animals and wanting to do something to protect animals. A lot more people were getting involved in hunt saboteurs. More people were starting to become vegan, for instance, and a lot of the organisations were starting to become radicalised because more of these more radical young people were getting involved with them. And I think it was just a natural progression for those people to want to take something, take action that was more direct and they felt would be more effective.
I see. Yeah. And so just to really harp on this point for a second, do you think that the state repression at that early stage fueled more, or was it just sort of irrelevant to this growing trend of activists doing ALF actions?
I think it was the publicity from the repression, because when we were sent to prison, I think probably the second most popular newspaper in the country, the newspaper with the second highest circulation, had it on their front page, and the story was very sympathetic to us. They called us martyrs in this newspaper. They obviously felt that would sell more copies of the newspaper by calling us martyrs and on outside, you see. And I think obviously tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people saw that, and I think that was a major reason for it. It was the publicity, that people who cared about animals had never heard about that sort of action being taken before, because it hadn't really been taken before. And I think the publicity made a lot of people think, especially young people, that's those people actually doing something. They're kind of taking action. They're not just writing letters or sending money to another organization. They're actually going out there taking action. And I think that kind of inspired something in people.
Okay, interesting. And so let's just focus on that period for a minute. So we're talking about the early 70s, maybe into the 80s a bit. Now, in the US, there was a whole lot of overlap between like the hardcore punk rock scene and like the sort of straight edge punk rock scene and vegans. And when I talk to people from that, who were active in that time period in the movement, they'll say things like, just sort of the coolest, biggest, toughest guys I knew were all vegan, and they were, doing their punk rock stuff. Was there an element of that in sort of the early period of the ALF?
Oh, quite definitely, yes. I mean, punk rock, I was, it was during my second prison sentence that the whole punk rock thing really came about, the kind of mid to late 70s. And I was reading about these punk rockers in the newspapers in prison, so I hadn't heard the music, and I kind of thought, oh, they sound like terrible people to me. That, you know, because stories about them spitting at the audience and fighting in the audience and all that. And I thought, oh no, they sound awful. And I'd like them at all. But when I was released from prison, there was a guy, a friend of mine from the Hunt Sabs. He played me some punk rock. It was the Ramones. He played me the Ramones, and I thought it was amazing. I thought, yeah, this is brilliant, you know. And I became a big fan of punk rock. I never dressed as a punk rocker. A lot of my friends did. You know, they wore all the clothes, and we go to all the gigs. We go and watch bands like the Clash and the Sex Pistols and the Jam. You know, the bands that are around at the time that are well known in the UK. We go to a lot of the gigs because I lived in London at the time, and a lot of the stuff was in London. And my friends would be dressed in the punk gear, and I'd be there just in the cap and corduroy trousers and a kind of maybe like a bomber jacket. You know, I never dressed as a punk, okay. But I was really into the music, and there was that kind of rebellious. There was a rebellious feeling about punk, but it was also a do-it-yourself thing. It was all about, you know, you kind of anyone can make that music. You know, you can go in the garage and, you know, get together with your mates and you can make punk music. So it was a kind of sort of do-it-yourself type movement in a way. And that was kind of similar to the ALF, because that was what the ALF was about. It wasn't about there being this big structured organisation with a hierarchy and somebody being paid loads of money to run it. It was people in local areas doing it themselves. So there was a similarity really with punk in that respect, in terms of how the whole thing operated. So I wouldn't say that everyone that was involved in the ALF was into punk music, but a lot of us were.
I see, yeah. So I think it really seems like you folks were the punk rockers of the vegan movement. And let's just get into that a little more. So like in punk, you have this rejection of hierarchies, you have this rejection of, you know, traditional ways of demonstrating excellence and sort of gatekeeping. And I understand that in the ALF, you said that you were the press officer, and that was one position where there is sort of like some expertise and you're, you know, publicizing ALF actions, but otherwise there isn't any sort of hierarchy. It's not like it's not like you like sign up and join up at your local recruiting station. Can you talk a little about like the structure?
Yeah, I mean, the ALF had kind of these principles that we laid down at the beginning.
Sure.
And as long as, when people carried out an action, as long as they stuck to those principles, they could claim that as an ALF action. The ALF was really the kind of name of a type of action, in a sense. So really, it would be very easy for somebody to set up an ALF group, because they just have to carry out an action that was in line with those principles, and they were the ALF. Yeah. So it was people didn't have to fill in forms or go for an interview or anything. They just did it. And so that's, I think, why it spread so rapidly, because it was very easy to. And at the time, of course, those actions were a lot easier to carry out, because there wasn't the level of security on places. Because now in the digital age, having security cameras and all that kind of thing is really cheap. They can be installed really cheaply, and like they're everywhere in the UK. On the streets, there's cameras everywhere, and it would be very easy for somebody to be caught doing direct, because of all these cameras that could track people's movements. In those days, it wasn't like that at all. Even only the really big places had any kind of security like that. The laboratories did. A lot of the laboratories did, because there was expensive equipment in them. But other places, like the places that supplied the animals to the laboratories, they didn't have anything like that. It was too expensive. They just had a lock on the door, really. And so it was very easy to do those actions. And now, places like that, they'd have lots of security, because it's so much cheaper. And so that kind of was one of the reasons why it was so much easier to do that type of action then than it is today.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to talk about, you know, the present moments. Maybe we can just transition to that. So one, so I think one advantage that you folks had, and maybe still have, I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the ALF today, but like when you don't have a big, massive hierarchical organization where people can say like, here's your recruiting base and here's how all these things work, it's harder for state repression to work because it's not like they can just, move in on some organization. Like if PETA wanted to do ALF actions, they would be shut down immediately. But because it's just sort of like a loose, not even loosely, but like not even connected group of cells doing their own stuff, and then the press officer even finds out about it afterwards, I'm assuming it's really hard for anybody to move in and do any sort of repression. Is that just before we move on to the present day, is that an accurate assessment of like part of the benefit?
It is, yes, and in fact the state was really slow to catch up with the ALF, in that it was a new thing and they didn't know how to deal with it. And I think that's why people were able to kind of get away with it for a long time. In other words, the things where I was arrested wasn't really through any very clever police investigation. It was just that on one occasion I was just caught. There was a security guard on a place who saw us and got in touch with the police, and they came arrest us. On a second occasion, somebody given the police my address, and I didn't think they had my address, and they came and arrested me and found evidence relating to what I'd done. It was stuff like that. It wasn't through any like really clever investigation that anyone was caught. These were just normal, and this was just the ordinary police, like the ordinary police force, ordinary police officers that did that. But what happened as time went on, and there were more and more actions, and the actions became more hard hitting. I think that the authorities began thinking we have to do something about this in an organised way. We have to organise something to combat these people because they're a real threat. Because of course, we were a threat to big business, because stuff like animal experimentation, it's big business, and some very powerful corporations were getting worried about what we were doing. And of course, with the hunting as well, there's some very influential people involved in that, and so we were hitting. We were kind of hitting very powerful people, and so they had an influence with government, and they were saying, "Hey, something needs to be done about these people. They're becoming a real threat." And then when that happened, the police started they formed special squads to investigate the ALF, and they put a lot more resources into tracking people down and into, I suppose, just a general investigation of things. And that's when more people began to be arrested. But it kind of took a few years for them to catch on to what was happening, because it was a new thing. Nobody'd taken that kind of action for animals before, and it kind of took them by surprise. But really, from our point of view, I think we kind of carried on in a sense as if we'd always get away with it, that we didn't really consider or didn't really stop to think that is what would happen, and really it was bound to happen, that we weren't going to be to get away with it for so long. We weren't able to operate so freely, in a sense,
Okay.
forever, because
Yeah,
it's not going to happen.
And so when I think about major shifts in the U.S. with respect to prosecuting ALF actions, I think about like the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And when things like that were passed, where all of a sudden, if you're doing an ALF style action, you're branded a terrorist and you're looking at many decades in prison. Did that have a big shift? And was that a different sort of repression than the early repression that actually led to more mobilization?
Well, we haven't got that act in the UK.
Sure.
But what has actually happened is there are several factors involved in why there's much less ALF actions now, a lot fewer actions these days, and there's really several factors to explain that. First of all is the one I've already mentioned, which is the security. I mean, basically, that there's cameras on the roads and on the highways that can see the registration plate of a car and can track people from one end of the country to the other. For instance, apart from the cameras on the street and cameras in businesses and all these things, that where it's the chances of being caught for something now are so much higher. That's the first thing. The second thing is the sentences for ALF activity and that type of activity became a lot greater. For instance, the first time that when I received a 3-year sentence, which was in 1975, a lot of that involved setting fire to things. I mean, we always made sure that nobody was. We did our best to make sure nobody would be injured in any of these things. Like, for instance, the laboratory that was being built that we set fire to, we waited till the workforce had gone. We hid and we watched, and then we checked the building, made sure nobody was there, nothing was in there before we did it. And it was the same with all these things. We were very careful because it is something that can be very dangerous. And that 3-year sentence, if I was to do that same thing today, the sentence would probably be 10, 15 years for that. And that's what happened. And people did get some very small sentences in the early days for some very big actions. But then as time went on, those sentences became much more for a similar type of action. So that was another aspect, the length of sentences people were being given. The third thing was the amount of effort the police and the authorities put into catching people and into investigating the ALF. They set up special squads, they put a lot more resources into it, they took it a lot more seriously, they gave it more priority. So there's that as well. And then the third thing was laws. There've been new laws brought in to combat activism, especially against laboratories, for instance. They brought in new laws so that people could more easily be prosecuted. And the second thing they did was that they started using existing laws that weren't meant to actually cover the sort of stuff that the ALF was doing or that similar groups were doing. But they like, for instance, blackmail. The law of blackmail has been used to give activists very long sentences, and blackmail was never meant to be used like that. It was kind of not, never. When that law was brought in, it wasn't the idea of using it against animal liberation activists. Just wasn't. It wasn't brought in for that reason. But technically, it kind of covered what people were doing, or they claimed it covered that, and so that was used and would still be used as well. So there was all these different forms of repression, I suppose, against activists, all kind of coming in at the same time. And that's, I think, those are some of the reasons anyway why there's so little ALF action today.
I see. So you had the security cameras that made it so much harder to do it, and it made it so that you get caught. You had the longer prison sentences. You had the police having special squadrons, infiltrating cells, just really bumping up their abilities. Then you have new laws and
new laws and other laws being used that weren't really meant to be used. So there's a combination of all those things.
Yeah.
And I think the other reason as well for many years was there was a change in the kind of mindset of younger people. That almost all the activists were young people. Occasionally you get an older person that came along. There was a guy who he'd been a butcher. He owned a string of butcher shops. And he was given a leaflet in the street about factory farming. And it seems strange, he didn't know about that. I don't think he really thought about what he was doing when he was chopping up the carcasses of animals, kind of like as if they weren't. He didn't make that link between that was a living animal and that animal had probably been kept in appalling conditions. But when he got this leaflet, he made that link, and he sold all his butcher shops, and he became an ALF activist, and he ended up being sent to prison. He was an older guy, but that kind of thing was very rare, and it was usually younger people. It was people, teenagers, people in their late teens and in their 20s. There were not many ALF activists that were under 30 years old. It was mainly young people that were doing this. And of course, young people are freer to do that type of thing. They haven't got responsibilities that would prevent them from taking that type of risk. But then there was a change in society, and young people became much more self-centered. They became just more interested in getting a job and getting a career and making money. And their focus was much less on things outside of that, was much less on the world in general and more on like their own, their own sort of personal interests. And that's been the situation for many years. It's starting to change now. We're starting to get young people now getting more involved in stuff, not necessarily ALF stuff or hardly ever ALF stuff because there's so little of it, but in other types of campaigning, there's a lot of youngsters now coming through, and that's good because there's been a change, kind of in the right direction, I think, as far as in young people's attitudes. But for many years, that wasn't the case, and that's yet another reason why the amount of activism went down.
That's really interesting. Yeah, wow, thank you. So one question that comes to mind when I think about the current manifestation of sort of the ALF spirit is I think about things like open rescue operations. So I think there's a big difference between like what groups like Direction Action Everywhere do and what ALF activists did, because DXC activists are not trying to destroy property.
No.
And they're also not hiding their faces. Like they go in, they bring their video cameras, they say like, we're going to take these animals out. And I think that they're also really trying to get court challenges. Like they're trying to take this battle into the court system so that they can, try to fight this and try to promote the legality of rescue in California. Can you comment on DXC and sort of the relationship between their actions, maybe the conceptual relationship between their actions and ALF actions?
Well, you see, there were some organisations around at the time of the ALF called in the UK called the Animal Liberation Leagues. The Animal Liberation League believed in mass action. They believed in involving lots of people and going into places in the daytime openly, and either taking animals or taking documentation that then can be used to prove what was happening. And these were really mainly laboratories or places that supplied animals to laboratories, and they would just storm a place with sometimes there are 100 people would just storm and just go into the place, and they would be able to get into places where the ALF couldn't get in, because a lot of these places would have security, but of course they just stormed in, you see, whereas the ALF would have difficulty, that they'd be trying to get around the security without being detected. But the Animal Liberation Leagues weren't worried about that. But they didn't go with the intention of being arrested. It would be like a lightning strike. They would have masks on. If there were cameras, that they wouldn't see their face because they'd be wearing masks. And the idea was to strike really quickly, go into a place really quickly with all these people, get loads of information or get animals, and then go before the police came. It didn't always work, and sometimes the police did come and people were arrested and stuff like that. But it was like a mass action. So it was similar to DXC in one respect, but not in another. It was similar in terms of lots of people involved in trying to get animals out of a place. But they didn't court arrest. They were trying to avoid arrest, and it was easier to avoid arrest in those days because there wasn't the level of security, there wasn't the level of kind of police interest that there is today.
I see.
Some trying that today, and also kind of in a sense, what they were doing was probably a bit more. I mean, DXC will walk openly into a place and take animals. They're not carrying out a lot of damage or anything like that. Whereas the animal liberation leagues would take stuff away. They would the kind of the seriousness in the eyes of the police, what they were doing was greater than what DXC do. So that's different, but it was an open thing in the daylight, similar to DXC. And I'm not sure really whether there's another way that DXC could do it, because it's kind of like there are certain actions that are like really difficult today because of security and because of police interests, because of the length of sentences people would receive. So probably in terms of the level of direct action that people can do, DXC is probably, you know, the kind of highest level that people would want to risk. There are people that still do ALF stuff and that do some stuff that would get them years in prison if they were caught. That still goes on, but it's much rarer. And it's kind of a lot easier for people to do. And we have similar things to that in this country, where people will go into a place and they don't always take animals. A lot of times just filming. They're just filming the conditions in the place and stuff like that, and trying to get media attention with it, which is kind of similar to what DXC do as well. So there are similarities with the past, and there are differences as well.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's really fascinating. And so, just to put a sharp distinction on this, one term from the social movements literature is the difference between so the membership compositions of social movement organizations typically take on one of two orientations, either a mass orientation or an insular orientation. And I think that one point you're making is that the ALF had an insular orientation, where it's like you have a very small group, smallest group as possible. Makes your security a lot easier. You don't have to worry about all these coordination problems. But you know that's only good for certain kinds of actions. Then you have a mass orientation where each individual activist is making like a much smaller commitment. They're like a little bit less involved. They're taking smaller types of risks, and it's not maybe not as important a part of their identity. And that's also, you know, a really important orientation for movements to have. And we talk about like the Animal Liberation League and groups like DXC, they're very different than the ALF because they have this mass orientation.
Yeah.
Yes. And then there's like lots of other differences too, with respect to the kinds of risks they're taking and whether they're how interested they are in arrest. Also economic damage. DXC typically finds animals who are of no financial value to the industry. They try to find individuals who are sick and dying, and they take those out so they can give them medical care. But they're not trying to inflict economic damage directly.
Because it became the sort of philosophy of the ALF developed really, you know, over the years, and the first actions were like kind of aimed at preventing stuff from happening. In other words, we'd go to the kennels of where the hunts were and damage their vehicles, and that was to actually stop them going out hunting the next day or later the same day. And it would be kind of fairly small amounts of damage that we do, just enough to immobilize the vehicle so that vehicle couldn't be started or couldn't be driven. And then later the idea of kind of economic sabotage came along, and that was you kind of, rather than do the minimum damage, you do the maximum damage, because what we were trying to do was cause that business or that industry economic loss. And the more economic loss they caused, the more likely they were to eventually be destroyed or to fold, for instance. And so that thinking developed. That wasn't the thinking at the beginning. It was more a preventative idea at the beginning, but then it became into let's put these people out of business. Let's hit them so hard financially that they can't operate. And that kind of did work really with there's another one now. That did work really with the very much with the fur trade, with
Okay.
stores that sold fur coats, for instance, that the damage caused to them made them feel it wasn't worth stocking fur anymore, because so much damage had been done to their business in general that it was better not to have the fur and not to have the financial loss. You see, so that thinking did work in terms of preventing animals from suffering and preventing them from being killed, because it did have a big impact. So there was that, and that was kind of not about anyone being out in the open saying, "Here I am, I'm doing this," and it was about people trying to avoid arrest, about people being secretive so they could carry on doing as much damage as they could.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So I think one question a lot of people have about the ALF is, are those sorts of tactics effective? And I think that you're making the argument that in the case of fur, they were, because that level of economic sabotage led to the destruction of particular fur businesses.
Yeah, there were in the UK there were two areas where the ALF had huge success, I would say, in terms of animals that were spared. One was the fur industry, because when the ALF campaign began in the mid-70s, there were loads of the big stores sold fur coats, what we call department stores, and like most major cities and a lot of towns have these big stores, and most of these stores had a fur department where they sold all sorts of fur items. And as well as that, you had the dedicated small fur stores, or fur shops as we call them. And every town, even small towns, would have one of those. And also the larger cities would have them in the suburbs. I lived in a suburb of London, quite some distance from the centre, around the corner from me. There was a fur shop which quite frequently got damaged.
I wonder how.
Yeah, I wonder how that was, why that was. Yeah. So that was the level of the fur trade at the time, and basically because of the ALF campaign, because there wasn't really anything else that would have been responsible for this. We now have only one department store in the country that has a fur department, and that's Harrods in London. And the only places where there are the actual smaller fur stores that people can actually go in and buy a fur coat are in London, and there's only very few. No other place in the country has one. They're gone. They're all gone. And that was really, there's no other explanation for that apart from the ALF action, that these places were just, either they were put out of business, or they decided that they had to get rid of the fur department because they were losing too much money, or worried about the risk of an attack. And that's what happened. And the fur industry has never recovered from that. You do get the occasional place which will sell garments with fur trim, or will sell gloves made of fur or hats made of fur. You do get, and then people campaign against those businesses, but it's massively smaller than what it was in the 70s and 80s, massively smaller, and I think that was a major victory for the ALF. And the other big success story in the UK for the ALF was to do with animal experiments. When the ALF began, there were, according to official figures, there are about 6.5 million experiments on animals every year in this country. And the figure had been rising all the time, and it had reached that peak of 6.5 million. When the ALF actions began, through the period of the most ALF actions, the most ALF action against animal experimentation, that figure dropped to below 3 million. So from it being 6.5 million every year, it was below 3 million every year. And there's no other explanation for it. There's no legislation was brought in to control animal experiments. There was the only explanation is that it was the impact, because the people doing experiments and people involved in doing experiments became very worried. They were worried about losing money, and I think they were worried as well about kind of personal attack, because I think that in a way the media did contribute to that by branding the ALF as terrorists, because they always made ALF activists to be much more dangerous than they really were. There's these terrorists that are going to attack people, etc., etc. And so that created a climate of fear amongst people that were involved in animal experiments. And so I think that caused them to look to put much more effort into finding non-animal methods of doing the experiments. So, and I think that's what happened, and that's why there was this huge decrease in the number of experiments. Once again, there's no other explanation for that other than it was the ALF, because it was kind of ran along at the same time as the ALF action was at its highest. So I think those are the two areas where the ALF really had a big effect. And of course, you're talking about millions of animals being spared through ALF actions. So those are the two big areas, the big success areas. And those were really the two things that the ALF mainly concentrated on. There were attacks on meat lorries, and there was obviously attacks on property connected with hunting, and property connected with intensive farming. Those things were attacked, but there wasn't really so much impact on those industries. The main impact was animal experiments and the fur trade.
I see. And I wonder about the long-term impact. So it seems from what you're saying that fur has still never recovered from the ALF. Has vivisection recovered in the UK?
Not up to the same level.
Okay.
There's been an increase. The number of experiments now is about 4 million. It's gone up from 3 to 4 million. A lot of the reason for that is genetics. There's a lot of genetic experiments now. That kind of genetic engineering has become more of a thing, especially on mice, for instance. They use a lot more for those experiments. So there's been that increase, and had ALF activity still been continuing at the same level, that increase may not have occurred.
Okay.
But the level has never got back. It's never got back to the huge level that it was in the mid 70s.
Got it. And that 4 million, does that include invertebrates and rodents as well as?
It includes rodents. So I'm not sure that it includes invertebrates.
Okay.
But it includes. I mean, it is mainly rats and mice.
Right. Yeah.
But that's only. They're just as important as a dog or cat or anything. Right. So that's not.
Yeah. So no, the reason why I ask.
But it does include rodents. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, the reason I ask isn't to dismiss the interests of rats and mice. It's just that in the U.S., when we look at reports of numbers used in experimentation, there's the vast majority of animals are not included because a lot of those numbers don't include mice and rats. So it's hard to get accurate numbers of like the total number in experiments for that reason. Yeah.
They do include rats and mice. I'm not sure they include invertebrates, but they include rats and mice.
Cool. Yeah, that's helpful.
They make up a huge percentage of it.
Yeah. No, I love rats. I used to have one who I lived with when I was growing up, and the only reason why I don't live with rescued rats now is because I'm turned out to be allergic.
Oh dear.
I have a lot of respect for rats. Yeah. So one question that we should talk about. So you've mentioned this a couple of times, where the ALF, it's I think it's misleading. It's wrong to think about the ALF as this dangerous terrorist group that's they're going to hurt people, because that's one of your principles, is that you don't commit acts of violence.
Yes.
You don't. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it kind of that was a principle right from the beginning.
Sure.
And I think it was because we had, certainly when I first became involved, when I was involved with the Band of Mercy, at the time I would have described myself as a pacifist. And so I think that was that was one of the reasons. It's because I sort of argued strongly that we shouldn't use violence against people, or seek to use violence, and that it should be concentrated on property. And everyone else was totally happy with that, even if they weren't pacifists as well, because they understood the kind of the tactical reason for that kind of there would have been several negative things about using violence towards people. One of them would be, obviously, you're kind of heightening the sentence that you get if you were caught. And secondly, I think it deters. We wanted lots of people to become involved, and once you start doing that, you limit the number of people, because people will say, well, I'm okay with the property damage, but I don't want to do that. So you're going to limit your number of activists. And also, we felt we could achieve what we wanted to achieve without injuring people. That we could carry out the actions against property to sabotage what was happening, or to cause the economic loss. And so we didn't actually need to use that physical violence against anyone. Then, I mean, kind of later on in my views, I'm no longer a pacifist, and haven't been for a long time. But I still understand the tactical reason for that, for the ALF not setting out to use violence. I think we said if somebody was attacked, they would defend themselves, of course, and that's different. But we wouldn't go out to actually directly attack anyone.
I see. That's really interesting. So really, like right now, I'm talking to the person who's responsible for introducing that part of the ALF's ideology, and so that's interesting. And like one distinction that I really interested in the context of nonviolence and social movements is between Gene Sharp's tactical nonviolence and other people like Martin Luther King's more ethical nonviolence, where it sounds to me like the original motivation came from this ethical commitment to pacifism. But then one of the reasons why it was accepted by everybody else was that the tactical benefit of nonviolence was really sort of carried the day. Is that fair?
Well, I think because of course there were 6 of us that started it off, and not everyone was a pacifist.
Right.
And so when we decided on to have this as a policy, for the people that weren't pacifists, it was a tactical thing right from the beginning. Right. For me, it was ethical and tactical, and then later on it became just tactical. Okay. But for some people, so we kind of varied a little bit in our motivation for it, but everyone agreed on it.
I see. Okay, no, that is really interesting. And I think that one challenge that we face when we're talking about nonviolence is that a lot of activists today, especially in the left, want to expand the concept of violence so that it includes all sorts of things other than the application of physical force. So they want to talk about things like certain kinds of hateful speech as violence. I imagine they'd also want to classify certain kinds of property destruction as violent acts. And I think this raises a really difficult challenge for anybody trying to, be in a social movement. How do you respond to those moves to inflate the concept of violence to include all sorts of other things beyond the application of physical force?
Well, I'd say it's a question of like what you're aiming to do.
Sure.
If you're aiming to save animals, and in order to do that, damage has to be done to property, then that has to be justified, because the property doesn't feel anything, whereas the animals do. So in that case, it's obviously, for me, there's no argument. It's obviously justifiable to damage the property if that results in animals being their lives being saved, or them being their suffering being prevented. Right. That's the argument I'd use to people.
Yeah.
And now if people talk about whether or not ALF actions were justified, I'd say, well, nobody's been injured in any of the actions, and yet millions of animals have been spared. So what would have been the alternative? How, I'll say to people, well, would you prefer that had never happened? Would you prefer that those animals had continued to suffer? Those animals had been killed.
That totally makes sense. One thing I worry about is that sometimes a conflation between, is this action justified and is this action violent? And I can imagine somebody saying, I can imagine somebody disagreeing with you about whether ALF actions are violent and still agreeing with you that they're justified. Does that make
It
sense?
depends. It depends on someone's definition of violence,
Sure.
doesn't it? It's totally down to
Yeah.
that.
But suppose
And
somebody comes to you and says, like, look, I think that certain kinds of property destruction are violent, but they're justified. So they want to recategorize what you do or what you've done in the past as justifiable violence as opposed to
yeah.
nonviolence.
But you see, when we came up with the principles, it kind of it didn't just say we won't use violence. We won't use violence. It explained a little bit more about that. Our actions were aimed against property, and they weren't aimed against people.
I see.
So that kind of it wasn't just saying we're not violent. It kind of actually defined what we meant by that, and
Okay,
so
yeah,
that
I see.
people to understand.
Good. So if somebody disagrees with you, it just seems like they're refusing to listen to the definition that you're using, and they're just sort of attributing the
Yeah.
wrong definition to you. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'd say so.
Cool. And it seems like you could still have your definition and still talk about the application of unjustifiable harm as being violent. And then
Yeah,
that might even allow you to include all sorts of other things that some people want to say are violent, even beyond physical harm.
yeah. I mean, these days I don't tend to, when I work out in my own head whether I consider something to be right or wrong, or justified or not justified.
Right.
I kind of don't use. I'll don't use the kind of distinction between violence and non-violence as kind of determining what my views are.
Got it.
I feel that some physical force against people is justified, for instance.
Sure.
So I don't kind of think of it, it just that kind of clear distinction between violence and non-violence as being the determining factor in how I feel about it.
I see. Yeah, and I think I'm on the same page. It seems to me like, well, I should be careful. I think that we probably have some disagreements about when it's justifiable to use force. But I think that we are both on the same page that the word violence shouldn't be used as the determining factor whether something is good or bad. I want to look at other things like exploitation and oppression and harm.
Yeah, but also you have a tactical. I mean, I think something can be acceptable in a moral way, but questionable in a tactical way.
Sure.
If, for instance, somebody would say somebody made the argument, well, if I go and kill an animal experimenter, then that's going to save the lives of lots of innocent animals that person will no longer be able to torture. And yes, I mean, that's true. I mean, they're right in saying that, but I think there's a further aspect to that. In other words, that if your aim is to save animals from experiments, if somebody goes and does that, then they're highly likely to be caught and put in prison, and then they're no longer effective. And they would probably save more animals had they not done that action and carried on campaigning in other ways.
Yeah.
So there's a tactical. I think there's a tactical objection or that kind of action is questionable from a tactical point of view, even if somebody can argue that it's morally justified.
I think that makes sense. And so as a consequentialist, what I'd want to do is bring in those tactical considerations to my moral evaluation. So I'd want to say that it's actually immoral to do that kind of act because of the fact that at the end of the day, it'll result in you doing less good for the animals.
Yeah, I think we have to think. I think we have to put a lot of thought into tactics and strategy, right. And I think that's something that probably the movement doesn't do enough of.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think they also don't do a good job of distinguishing between tactics and strategy, where they just think about any sort of planning and they don't think about different levels of planning.
No, and I think that this is I mean, it's a problem with humans in general. People don't think enough about what they're doing or the consequences of what they're doing or the long-term effects of what they're doing. And so, of course, that's going to be the same with many people who campaign for animals. They're also going to, find it difficult to think in that kind of way. And also you have to take into consideration if you're, I mean, there's a sense in which I consider it to be a war, and that doesn't necessarily mean you mean violence. But what I'm saying is it's a concerted struggle, a concerted effort. And so if you kind of you have to take into account this, if you're fighting a war, you have to take into account the strengths of the enemy. You can't ignore that and say, well, we're just going to kind of carry out a certain type of action anyway, even though you're coming up against one of the areas where the enemy is the strongest. You have to take that into account. And because the state has changed, because the opposition to animal liberation has changed, then our campaigning, our struggle for animal liberation has to change to take account of that. You can't just ignore that. You got to think, okay, so something's happened. We're going along a certain road, and then that road's been blocked off to us because of the actions of the state. So okay, so we won't kind of carry on banging our head against a brick wall. We'll find another road. We'll find another way around. And I think that's kind of what's kind of happening now. I think. Because although there's a lot less ALF action, I don't feel sad about that. I don't worry about that because I see that there's other ways of doing it, and probably other ways of doing it that are actually even more effective, certainly in the long term. It's kind of where I am now, to be honest. And it's not about no longer believing it. I mean, I totally believe in animal liberation, but that doesn't mean I'm always going to follow the same path in achieving animal liberation. I'm going to look and see, well, which is the best way to achieve it, and that can vary from time to time. That can be according to what else is happening.
Yeah. And so what are you doing now? What sorts of things do you do now to sort of continue the fight, even though you're no longer doing ALF?
Well, the main thing I do is vegan outreach.
Okay.
Main thing I do is outreach. And the kind of reasons for that is because one of the major problems with the ALF and with any kind of direct action organisation really is that there can be little or no interface with the public. I mean, it certainly wasn't with the ALF. The only time there was kind of that happened was maybe through my work as the press officer and other stuff that's got in the media, where the publicity surrounding an action has an educational effect. If you can kind of make it so that it has, because often the articles in newspapers about ALF actions were just, there was this bunch of terrorists that went along and destroyed a place, and kind of that's it really, and it doesn't really go into why it happened, or to educate people that about what's happening, and also to educate people about what they can do about it, because they're not going to go and break into a place, but they could do something in their own lives, like not consuming animal products, or not putting money into animal research, for instance, that could make a difference. And so it's very difficult to have an educational aspect and to have something that's aimed at the ordinary public with direct action. I mean, DXC may be a bit different if they're trying to take movies of what they do and to show to people this is what's happening in these places. So what you need to do is go vegan to stop it. And I can understand that there is an education aspect to that. But with the ALF there wasn't, and with kind of groups like the Hunt Saboteurs, for instance, there isn't. It's just direct action to save animals, and that's valid. That's a good thing to do. But it kind of doesn't go. It doesn't go to the core of what the problem is. I mean, we have to think about why is it that animals are oppressed? Why are animals oppressed? Why is this horrific situation? Why do we have this horrific situation of animal oppression in the world? And for me, the main reason is speciesism. It's human supremacism. It's people thinking that humans are more important than other animals, and therefore humans are entitled to do all these things to other animals and to use them and oppress them and persecute them. And so, unless we challenge that mindset, unless we challenge that way of thinking in people, we're not going to get very far. unless we change that in a lot of people, we're not going to get very far. We're not going to change things. We may save animals here or there. We may be able to go in a place and grab a few animals, rescue, or stop a fox being killed on a hunt or whatever. Yeah, we'll be able to do that in a small way. If we want to do it big scale, if we want widespread animal liberation, we have to educate people. We have to change the way people think, and that can only really be done through education. And so that's vitally important. So that's why I think vegan outreach is really important. That's the reason that I've already said, because it challenges speciesism at its root. Because when you think about, most ordinary people, they're not involved in animal experiments. They're not involved in the fur trade. They're not. They don't go hunting animals. I mean, some do, but most don't. And so the most speciesist thing that those people do in their everyday lives is consuming animal products. That they're putting money, they're paying someone to kill an animal for them. Basically, that's what they're doing. They're paying someone else to oppress an animal, and so we've got to. That's what we've got to challenge. We've got to challenge that. That's really important. But also in terms of numbers of the numbers of animals that we can save or that we can spare from suffering and slaughter. That if for instance, certainly in the UK, if I educate somebody to go vegan, then basically I've spared over 100 animals a year, because for each person in this country, there's like 100 animals are slaughtered every year to feed them on average. And that's like a kind of, that's a huge return, really. What other type of action could I do where I would spare that number of animals?
Right.
It would be difficult, wouldn't it? So it's kind of, it isn't something that's kind of far in the future, like that's kind of not tangible in a way. Because the thing is, if people go and rescue a dog from a pound, and or they go and save a fox on a hunt or something like that, then that's a direct. They know, well, I've saved that animal directly. I know I've saved that animal, and I'll get satisfaction from that. And there tends to be a thinking that vegan outreach isn't like that. That you're not really kind of saving any animals in a way, but of course you are, because if you educate someone to be vegan, you are, because it's supply and demand. If there's less demand for a product, there'll be less supply, and so you are doing that, even though it seems not so direct, and so it's you kind of, probably out of any other form of action, vegan outreach actually is the kind of most efficient in terms of sparing animals. I would. So there's kind of that reason as well, it's too. And that doesn't mean that I don't support other things. I mean, we do, I do a lot of stuff in support of animal rescue. I do stuff in support of hunt saboteurs and other types of campaigns for animals. But my main thing is vegan outreach for that reason, because it goes to the very root of why animals are being oppressed in the first place.
Yeah, that is an amazing trajectory, an amazing place probably to end this call, because I love that we end by talking about the root of all animal oppression, this speciesist ideology that we need to challenge through vegan education. Well, thank you so much. I think that, I hope we win. I'm gonna fight for this. I do as much vegan outreach, vegan education as I can. I'm gonna keep pushing for this. But thank you so much. You have such a wealth of information, and I hope that hopefully we'll get a lot of people to really sit down and digest all the things.
I kind of hope so. I think it's important to be positive. It's the point in being negative about things doesn't achieve anything. You've got to say, instead of thinking about, a lot of people dwell on the suffering of animals. I mean, we're in the middle of like the most horrific situation imaginable.
Yeah.
But there's no point thinking too much. We need to think about how can we do something about it, not think too much about what's happening. We know it's happening. We know what's there. That's always in our minds, but not to dwell on that, but to try to think about, okay, what do I do about this? What do I do to stop it? Because, crying over the animals isn't going to save any of them. It's actually taking action that's going to do it, and that's what everyone needs to think about and be positive. I mean, we can win if enough people are active, enough people organise things. We can win. We can do it. It is possible, and we need always to be positive and always to be dynamic.
Yeah, and that's one thing that really strikes me about you, and sort of struck me from the beginning of this call. You just exude so much positivity. Like when I talk to you, I get the sense that I'm talking to somebody who's really happy, who really loves doing vegan outreach. And I think when somebody talks to you, I imagine that they have a really good experience, even if they disagree with you.
Well, the thing is that it's not a chore.
Right.
It's not, it's kind of, it is an enjoyable experience because, you're with fellow people that, share the same views as you. They're your friends that you're doing this thing with. You've got a really common bond with those people. And also, you kind of know that you're doing something positive. You know that people are going to go vegan because of what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
You may not know. Sometimes you'll get an individual person about an individual person that's gone vegan because, of something you've done. But most of the time you don't know. But by the law of averages, a lot of those people will have gone vegan. I mean, that's why the numbers are increasing, And so it's a really positive thing. It's not like, it's not a kind of it's not like a chore that's something that has to be done and it's unpleasant. It is a pleasant experience, and I would really, it's one of these things that people, once people get into it, they think this is great. And I mean, we have people that they've gone years and years without doing any activism, and they'll do a bit of activism. It might just be delivering leaflets, or it might be helping on a stall, and then they'll come back and back again because they realise, they think, hey, that was okay, I enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm.
Why did I never do that before? But now I'm going to do it because it's great. And I'd say to everyone, get involved in stuff.
Yeah, and I think one thing people don't often realize is that when you're doing vegan outreach well and you're doing vegan education well, you're giving people a powerful gift, because you're helping them connect with their values in a way that they haven't been able to before. One thing, so I give talks about vegan outreach and just how to have better conversations about controversial issues. And I think one of the main things I stress is that we're helping people fight against alienation. Like, we're helping people connect with themselves in a more powerful way than they could before. And that it's not like we're imposing upon them. It's like we're offering them a gift.
Yeah, because what you're having is you're trying to have a discussion with people rather than an argument.
Yeah. Avoid nobody changes their mind from an argument.
Yeah, you don't change. You're not trying to batter that person down, or you can't force them to be vegan. Certainly, we can't. We can't at the moment anyway. And so people have to feel that they've made that decision themselves. And so what you've got to do is provide people with the information, and then they'll go away and digest that. And we always give them a booklet or something that they can take home and read with them, as well as talking to them.
Yeah.
And we often have vegan food samples, because that attracts people. People are interested, and it gives them a reason to come to the table, and all these things. And you kind of, sometimes you can feel angry that people are resistant, and they'll come up with all these like ridiculous excuses not to be vegan that we all know about, and you kind of you go through kind of dealing with them, and you're trying still to be friendly to the person, because if somebody doesn't like you, they're not going to take notice of what you're saying. So you've got to, even if you don't feel like being present and friendly, you have to be, that's part of, otherwise you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So it's that as well. And
excellent.
We just have to, it's not a difficult thing to do. It's a pleasurable thing to do, and it's a meaningful thing to do, because after all, as far as we know, we're only here once on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've only got one chance to have a meaningful life and do something important. And what can be more important than achieving animal liberation? That's the hugest form of oppression that there's ever been on the earth. And we can put an end to it. I mean, that's a huge thing for anyone to be involved in, and to have a really meaningful life, thinking, I played a part in that. I really did something in my life that made a huge difference. And I think it's for someone not to have that, I kind of feel sorry for someone that hasn't got that kind of lives their life, and they don't really do anything, they don't achieve anything, the world isn't a better place because they lived. It must be awful to be like that. But we don't need to be like that. We can, we can really make a difference.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so I think I'm gonna thank our guests for tuning in today. I think it's a really positive, uplifting message to end on, where we can actually go out there and make a difference. So let's all do it. So thanks so much for tuning in, and thanks, Ronnie. It was really great to get to know you and talk about these issues. I think I learned a lot from you, and looking forward to watching this again.
That's great, and me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you as well, and I wish you all the best with all the good work that you're doing.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.